I must also say that Bob Rucker proposes a hypothesis for the image formation very similar to mine. And since we are still at the level of initial hypotheses, it's obvious that there are several different assumptions for these hypotheses. However, there are several analogies between the two hypotheses, and these are essentially caused by two similar ways of interpreting the same phenomenon with different details. Both, in fact, are based on a flow of electrons that produces a vertical electric field, which in turn produces the corona discharge.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And if you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more episodes. I am the author of the book The Only Witness, which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last 2 millennia. Today, I'm speaking with Giulio Fanti, and he is one of the world's top researchers and presenters on the
Thank you.
Shroud of Turin. And it's so good to have him here today. We met in person just a few months ago in St. Louis at the Seek conference, and it was just wonderful to get to see him in person and do a whole bunch of other things. But with that, let me tell you a little bit about Giulio. So, since 1996, Giulio has been the Associate Professor of Mechanical and Thermal Measurements at the Department of Industrial Engineering at the University of Padua. He is the founding member of the Interdepartmental Center for Space Studies and Activities, called CISAS-G Colombo, and he's secretary of the Italian group of official teachers of mechanical and thermal measurements and was a member of international groups for important space missions. He has been studying the Shroud of Turin for the last 25 years and has been coordinator of the Shroud Science Group for about 20 years, which has more than 100 scholars, mostly Americans, and was a member of the scientific committee of several conferences. He's recently named the coordinator of the university research project on the Shroud, funded by the University of Padua. His current research activity is aimed at explaining, at least partially, the process of the body image formation and still not yet reproducible, the 3D reconstruction of the wrapped man's posture, the dating of the relic with alternative methods to the carbon-14 and the micro-nano analysis of body fluids to better define the effect of the torture suffered by that man on the Shroud. He is the author of more than 200 works, including books, educational texts, and publications in important Italian and in international journals, most of them on the subject of the Shroud of Turin. Giulio, welcome. It's so good to have you today.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Hello, thank you for the invitation.
Oh, absolutely. I really look forward to hearing your perspectives. So, we were at the Shroud Conference, the Shroud Educational Endeavors Conference in St. Louis. And so, tell us a little bit about what you found to be most interesting there.
Well, I must say I found many interesting things. I will focus mainly on the presentations I personally attended and found most impressive. First, I was particularly interested in your summary of the new book, The Only Witness. As lawyer Theodora Pappas writes, the book masterfully weaves together numerous historical and scientific facts about the Holy Shroud into a compelling novel centered on this precious relic. I also found John Jackson's presentation very interesting. He proposed a morphological method for distinguishing the image on the Holy Shroud from other images. Equally noteworthy was the presentation by Keith Propp, a member of John Jackson's group. He offered a different interpretation of the wrapping of the Sudarium of Oviedo. This interpretation was, of course, challenged by the Spanish shroud scholars present, and I believe this exchange will stimulate further scientific research on both the shroud and the sudarium. We should also not overlook Teddy Pappas's presentation. She is relatively new to the Holy Shroud community, and it was great to hear her perspectives, titled Follow the Evidence, the Turin Shroud's Ultimate Confirmation of Jesus of Nazareth's Divinity. She presented what she described as tangible evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Likewise, Bob Rucker's presentation, Neutron Absorption Explains the Carbon Dating Consistent with the Authenticity of the Shroud, was highly significant. It was complemented by Cesar Barta's presentation, Was the Shroud Irradiated with Neutrons? Both presentations are fully consistent with my own results. These presentations propose that the Holy Shroud was exposed to neutron radiation approximately 2,000 years ago. Together, they reflect a growing scholarly trend toward invoking neutron radiation to explain the mysteries surrounding Christianity's most important relic. Finally, I must mention my two presentations: Novelties about the Holy Shroud of Jesus Christ in Turin, and the Holy Shroud Corona Discharge to explain the unique condition of the body image prepping. From all the many congresses and conferences that I've attended, I do not recall receiving as many expressions of thanks and congratulations as I did following these two presentations. The response reflected strong interest in the innovative elements of the scientific research being done on the Holy Shroud.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I found I didn't get to go to all of the presentations, but I did go to some of the ones you mentioned, and there were some really fascinating things going on. You presented two different talks at the conference. Tell us about one of them, which was your talk on corona discharge and the mystery of Jesus's image explained.
So, as I just said, my first presentation concerned the latest news in general about the Holy Shroud, including the selective radioactivity of the relic. This second presentation, however, was about one of the greatest mysteries about the Holy Shroud. It dealt in more detail with several hypotheses about the formation of the body image. To my knowledge, it hasn't been satisfactorily explained by any shroud scientist. The novelty lies in the fact that to try to give an explanation for what we see and touch, we need to combine many recent scientific results concerning image formation. We need to articulate a very complex hypothesis that unfortunately we don't have time to describe during this interview. Nevertheless, I call it divine photography. That is, a photograph taken 2,000 years ago with an as-yet undetermined mechanism. In practice, the divine photograph is about a holy shroud which, as a burial cloth, tightly wrapped the corpse of Jesus Christ. This was caused by a cascade of events. Initially, there was a so-called corona discharge, which is an emission of electrons in a very intense electric field. This was caused a flow of vertical neutrons. Unfortunately, this mechanism cannot as yet be explained. This mechanism was linked to the Holy Fire of Jerusalem, which I also presented on. This then, I believe, triggered the so-called Maillard reaction. This is a reaction between sugars and starches facilitated by urea secreted from Christ's body after the severe scourging suffered by Jesus. The secreted urea was most likely caused by kidney failure, leading to a large amount of urea circulating in the blood. So as I said, it's a combination or a cascade of very complex factors that, when put together, allow us to reconstruct quite well what we see on the Holy Shroud.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, there were other presentations on the image creation process. You know, you were talking about the corona discharge and the Maillard reaction, and then Bob Rucker, of course, has his theories there. So, how does your theory kind of how is it similar, and how is it different from what Bob Rucker presented?
I must also say that Bob Rucker proposes a hypothesis for the image formation very similar to mine. And since we are still at the level of initial hypotheses, it's obvious that there are several different assumptions for these hypotheses. However, there are several analogies between the two hypotheses, and these are essentially caused by two similar ways of interpreting the same phenomenon with different details. Both, in fact, are based on a flow of electrons that produces a vertical electric field, which in turn produces the corona discharge. But Bob Rucker thinks of a generation, at least from what I understand, of a very intense electric field by the human body itself, by the corpse wrapped in the Holy Shroud, and he refers to this as the energy of the resurrection. I, on the other hand, based on what I consider to be evident characteristics of the bodily image, assume a corpse, that is, a floating human body immersed somehow in a vertical electric field, which is to the phenomenon related to the resurrection. Consequently, while Rucker assumes image formation through vertical radiation, I make a different assumption. This assumption is consistent with the physics of a floating body and assumes radiation perpendicular to the emitting surface, that is, the skin. Thus, the skin emits radiation perpendicularly to itself. Unlike Bob Rucker, as it relates to the wrapping of the shroud around the human body, I believe that the Holy Shroud wrapped the human body in a very tight way that would have reduced the obvious image distortions that would have resulted from radiation perpendicular to the skin. Furthermore, I don't believe Rucker considers the effect of the so-called cosine law, which, for me, is the basis for interpreting the frontal and dorsal images imprinted on the Holy Shroud without the formation of lateral images, that is, images from the sides of the body. Therefore, there are still several things to compare and improve, but I hope that with Rucker's collaboration, we will reach a point of agreement that will lead to a single hypothesis for image formation.
Yeah, interesting. I'm looking forward to understanding both of the those potential hypotheses better. Now, changing the subject a little bit, you found radioactivity in the blood samples. So tell us what that means and its implications potentially on dating the shroud.
This is a truly important discovery I made last year, which I believe overturns many scientific interpretations of the Holy Shroud. First of all, I must say that I discovered beta radioactivity, which is predominantly evident in a certain type of the blood on the Holy Shroud. I analyzed 3 different types of blood, and only one of these 3 types, what I believe to be post-mortem blood, is highly radioactive. Incidentally, this blood is the most prevalent and would be the most receptive to this radiation during the phenomenon of the resurrection. Well, there are alpha, beta, and gamma radioactivity. Beta radioactivity is, by definition, the emission of electrons. I wanted to emphasize something. In the various scientific hypotheses and analyses that are being made, the same underlying phenomenon always recurs. Earlier, I spoke about the corona effect, or the corona discharge. Corona discharge is produced by electrons. I found an emission of electrons in the blood, so something that is always correlated. The Holy Shroud was not evenly irradiated. In some areas, the radiation was very intense, and in others, much less so. And this effect also needs to be explained, and therefore, an in situ analysis of the complete Holy Shroud would be necessary. However, unfortunately, this is not possible, and consequently, for the moment, we have to stop at this point. Nevertheless, what is extremely interesting is that this radioactivity, which I found on microscopic samples, is, based on my analysis, and is several orders of magnitude higher than the normal radioactivity of blood. This means that there was an extremely intense phenomenon that acted 2,000 years ago, which produced this radioactivity, and it is still very evident today. It effectively consists of electron radiation that was produced 2,000 years ago. But the real question is, of course, what produced it? Obviously, radioactivity was not known 2,000 years ago, and it is therefore very difficult to explain. We know, however, that such radioactivity could be the product of a neutron flux, and modern science tells us this. A neutron flux, however, is not scientifically explainable 2,000 years ago in a tomb, moreover, one sealed with a stone. The simplest thing to think of, therefore, is what we call the phenomenon of the resurrection. In addition, it is also very important to correlate the result of the 1988 carbon-14 dating with this radioactivity because, in my opinion, with a more detailed scientific interpretation, it completely overturns the medieval dating resulting from the 1988 testing that was done. It is well known that any sample cannot be properly dated using carbon-14 dating if it is radioactive. And this highlights the carelessness with which the laboratories performed the test in 1988. Because before dating such an important sample, they should have carried out preliminary parallel analyses, including radioactivity testing. If they had tested the linen samples prior to dating, they would have found radioactivity. As we know, that radioactivity acts at the atomic level, and it can change and transform atoms of one type into another. If a linen sample is radioactive, like the Holy Shroud, it can imply that the nitrogen contained in it could have transformed into carbon-14. And what does this produce? It produces a change to the isotopic ratio measured by the laboratories, that is, the isotopic ratio between carbon-12 and carbon-14. Consequently, ignoring the statistical errors of the laboratories, I believe that, all in all, the isotopic ratio they determined is actually quite correct and acceptable. Therefore, I wouldn't bring up arguments like some Shroud researchers do, saying that the laboratories made mistakes in measuring the ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-14 in the samples. They made small errors, that's clear. But the result, roughly speaking, is that the isotopic ratio is acceptable. So where did they make the mistake? Well, the very serious mistake they made was to directly correlate the isotopic ratio they measured to a date, a medieval date, without taking into account other effects. These other effects include the systematic effects, environmental effects of the radioactivity of the sample, and the subsequent enrichment of the carbon-14 due to the transformation of the nitrogen-14 into carbon-14. This is a point that should be developed further, but unfortunately, at least here in Italy, everyone is silent and may be trying to hide this fact for unknown reasons. If we made this correction, which would be on the order of a millennium, not centuries, then we would probably arrive at the date of the Holy Shroud to be in the 1st century AD. This would confirm the results of many other datings that have also been carried out by my university, including mechanical, chemical, and X-ray dating, which are all consistent with a date in the 1st century AD. Finally, I must say that once this correction for the radioactivity being present in the Holy Shroud is verified, then this implies that neutron radiation occurred 2,000 years ago. Because science is unable to explain such high radiation without the hypothesis of neutron radiation, then, in my opinion, the result of the 1988 carbon-14 dating should be corrected from yielding a medieval dating of the Holy Shroud. It should be transformed as the first scientific proof of the resurrection of Christ, and I think this is very important. Yes, the radiation is so very important.
Yeah, interesting. The radiation is such an important piece. So now, tell us how the radiation and amino reactions and electric field effects may have potentially created this unique 3D body image without distortion.
As I said before, I must say that it is a set of very complex chemical-physical processes that produced this image. In my book titled The Holy Fire and the Divine Photography, which I wrote with Bob Siefker, I called this image formation process divine photography. This is because the image has all the ingredients of a very complex photograph from 2,000 years ago. It is obviously not a photograph taken with a camera, but with elements comparable to those needed to develop a photograph from the 1st century. As I said before, I can't go into detail because I don't think we have the time, but in summary, this complex hypothesis is based, first of all, on a tight wrapping of the burial shroud around the corpse, which was exhibiting considerable rigor mortis. At a certain moment, probably correlated with the resurrection, there was this emission of neutrons, a vertical flux of neutrons that, in turn, produced an emission of electrons, and therefore, a corona discharge. This corona discharge, in my opinion, is closely related to what is reproduced every year in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and is known as the Holy Fire, or the Divine Fire. This Holy Fire has many characteristics that allow me to correlate this divine photograph to the energy needed to imprint the image. But not only energy is needed, raw material is also necessary. This raw material is found in the hypothesis of the Maillard reaction, which, as I mentioned before, occurs between the sugars, or rather the polysaccharides, contained in the linen fibers, and the urea exuded from the corpse. Normally, a corpse is always exuding fluids after being placed in the tomb, but the amount of urea is so minimal that it doesn't allow this phenomenon to occur. In the case of Jesus, however, we must consider the fact that Jesus was scourged with almost 500 blows of the whip, almost 500 wounds from the scourging, many of which we can see in the frontal and dorsal images of the Holy Shroud. However, keep in mind that the Holy Shroud only shows the frontal and dorsal images, not the lateral ones where additional wounds would be found. Therefore, adding the lateral wounds that are not imprinted on the Holy Shroud to these 500 wounds, we arrive at about 700 or 800 wounds, truly unimaginable. This also helps us understand the extent of the suffering that Jesus willingly endured for us and for our salvation. But from a scientific point of view, of these at least 500 blows of the whip, at least 5 are located in the area of the kidneys. Well, what does this mean? Doctors tell me that direct blows to the kidneys like this very likely cause kidney failure. Kidney failure means that the blood is no longer filtered by the kidneys. When this happens, urea begins to circulate in the blood, producing further, unimaginable pain and suffering. But that's a separate issue. What interests us for the divine photograph is this large amount of urea, which, exuded by the corpse, managed to combine through the Maillard reaction and, through energy which is very similar to that seen in the Holy Fire, to produce the image. This reaction is called the Maillard reaction between sugars and amines, and it's not so strange. I think we all have experience with this reaction because when we see bread placed in the oven, when it browns, it undergoes a brownish discoloration, and that is precisely the so-called Maillard reaction. Here, the energy of the resurrection, which occurred in a closed environment like a tomb, makes it difficult to believe that it came from the outside. Someone has hypothesized a lightning strike, even a ball lightning. But how could this ball lightning have entered the tomb sealed by a stone? Everything remains related to this very intense and very particular phenomenon that we can consider linked to the energy of the resurrection. From a scientific point of view, the neutrons produced by this energy emission produced electrons, and therefore an electric field. And by the way, this electric field was measured by the Russian scientist Andrei Volkov in the Holy Sepulchre in connection with the formation of the Holy Fire. It was said at the beginning that the image on the Holy Shroud is a three-dimensional image. This image encodes information that is directly correlated to the hypothetical distance between the body and the Holy Shroud. And I might add, without evident distortions of the type found in the Mask of Agamemnon, which does show evidence of distortions. However, I must say that some minimal distortion is clearly visible, especially around the shoulders and back, and this is an error that has led many sculptors to create statues of Jesus with a very voluminous chest. This is an interpretative error because one must take into account some minimal distortion based on how the cloth wrapped the body. Therefore, the phenomenon is very complex and delicate to interpret scientifically, so there are still many things to investigate and clarify.
Yeah, very interesting. Let me change the topic altogether, although it is very resulting on it, and you also mentioned it, and that is the Holy Fire of Jerusalem. So tell us about the Holy Fire of Jerusalem.
This is a phenomenon which I can't interpret otherwise is indeed a miracle, a miraculous phenomenon that I have experienced personally in the Holy Sepulchre as the Holy Fire. It is a phenomenon that has manifested itself for about 1700 years every Holy Saturday inside the edicule of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. In particular, on Holy Saturday afternoon, the Orthodox Patriarch enters the edicule of the Holy Sepulchre carrying some unlit candles. He kneels before the burial stone and recites a very particular prayer. I must point out that this is only reported by witnesses, specifically the patriarchs who have entered the tomb in the past, because the Orthodox Church does not allow witnesses or cameras to film the phenomenon. However, some patriarchs have recounted and written about similar events, although sometimes with slight variations. As an aside, I asked the Orthodox Patriarch if he would allow me to conduct some analyses, but of course he said no, because for the Orthodox, one must believe by faith and not by scientific evidence to strengthen that faith. According to these patriarchs, after this long, special prayer, the stone of the Holy Sepulchre often exudes a liquid that the patriarchs themselves have identified as myrrh. Afterward, in one way or another, a kind of luminous mist forms, rising from the stone and gradually forming a column of smoke, a luminous column, which at a certain point is recognized as fire, a bluish fire. Incidentally, this bluish fire is directly linked to an electric excitation that is consistent with what has been measured. Once this fire, this divine light, as they call it, is formed, the patriarch lights the unlit candles and carries them out of the edicule, distributing them to the other pilgrims present. Now, this is highly debated, I must say, especially in Catholic circles, where they accuse the Orthodox patriarch of going inside with a lighter and lighting the candles. In fact, I had this discussion with a bishop from Jerusalem, a Catholic bishop, when he met me and said, "Yes, you went to see these things, but we know that the Orthodox Patriarch enters the Holy Sepulchre with a lighter, lights the candle, and brings it out." I responded to the Bishop of Jerusalem in a way that silenced him. I'm not interested in what happens inside the edicule of the Holy Sepulchre. I'm interested in what comes out, because a cold fire emerges, a cold fire that remains cold for about 10 minutes. And it is this fire that is distributed to the pilgrims. I was fortunate enough to be present, and I was able to verify that in the first 10 minutes or so, this fire has a cold temperature, because a normal fire reaches to over 1,000 degrees, but this fire is perceived to have a temperature of about 30 to 40 degrees. I verified this by holding a bundle of 33 burning candles, given to me by pilgrims before entering the Holy Sepulchre, under my chin, and I didn't feel any pain. A flame from 33 candles, and I'm still here telling you about it. I must say that I felt as if I was being caressed by something warm that enveloped my chin and face. Then I managed to do an experiment. I took two nominally identical candles. One I lit with a lighter I had in my pocket, as the Catholics say, and the other I lit with the Holy Fire of Jerusalem. Above the two candles, at a distance of about 10 centimeters, I placed a linen fabric similar to that of the Holy Shroud. After about 10 seconds, the part affected by the flame of the candle lit with the lighter caught fire, and I had to blow it out to extinguish the small fire. Conversely, the other part affected by the holy fire was only singed, forming a light brownish imprint, similar to those of the bodily image on the holy shroud. As I mentioned before, Andrei Volkov, in conjunction with the holy fire, measured an electric field that sent his measuring instrument off the scale. This confirms the scientific hypothesis of the neutron flux, that in turn produces these electrons, and in turn produces this holy fire, which remains for no longer than about 10 minutes. So why does this last only 10 minutes? Because the electrons in the surrounding plasma strike protons and neutrons, which acquire the kinetic energy supplied by the electrons, thus giving a different aspect to the holy fire, which then increases its temperature. These and other facts lead me to believe that the bodily image on the holy shroud is closely related to the holy fire. This, in some respects, represents the memory of the energy released during Christ's resurrection. Therefore, the holy fire is not exactly what formed 2,000 years ago during Christ's resurrection, but is rather a reflection of that explosion of energy linked to the resurrection.
Yes, the holy fire is just so interesting. There's so much there to learn and understand, and I'd love to be able to spend more time with you on that question. But let's break for the moment. But one thing that's very important is you have an exhibition coming up in the spring.
Yes.
And so tell us about that. How can we find it and sign up for it? And where is it? And what's the focus?
Yes, in Schio, in the province of Vicenza, Italy, I recently purchased a fairly large space called the Shroud Science Center, where I am setting up a private, permanent exhibition on the Holy Shroud. I have been fortunate enough to see several exhibitions, especially in America, and based on those, I have gained some experience on how to set up this exhibition. Unlike other exhibitions, I must say that this one will not only display copies of the Holy Shroud, including life-size replicas, and various historical documents on the subject. Incidentally, the great shroud scholar Aldo Goreschi donated to me an exhibition he had toured with for several years, consisting of about 50 panels, which has given me the opportunity to display them in this exhibition and, of course, to enrich it. But there will also be a more innovative section, especially concerning new scientific results, with demonstrations of how the bodily image of Jesus Christ, laid in the tomb and resurrected from the dead, probably formed. I have just ordered some plasma spheres that allow me to reproduce the corona discharge in order to show the public the effects of these discharges under certain conditions, such as those hypothesized for the Holy Shroud. This exhibition will also include a section dedicated to the display of alleged tears and sweat of blood from statues that I am currently studying, many of which I consider authentic and therefore of great interest. I also consider authentic the so-called handkerchief of Padre Pio, of which I am displaying a copy. It was officially studied by me through my University of Padua and reproduces on both sides two extremely superficial images, similar to those we see on the Holy Shroud. One depicts the face of Saint Pio of Petralcina. The other depicts the face of Christ, which is very similar to the image produced on the Holy Shroud. This handkerchief also lacks a scientific explanation for how these images could have formed. Therefore, in the university report, I had to state that science stopped there because I couldn't find an explanation for what I was studying. So I invite everyone, when the exhibition opens for Easter next year, to come and visit me by appointment so that I can actually show you what I have accomplished.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, I don't know if I could make it there, but I certainly will see if I can. I'm so looking forward to seeing you again and then learning more. And it sounds like you're going to have some very interesting discussions on corona discharge and everything that we spoke about. So
Thank you.
very fascinating. Yes. Well, anyway, thank you, Giulio, so much for participating today. And it's been very interesting to hear your commentary and some of the new things that you're working on. And for the audience, please stay tuned for many other videos in this series of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And if you'd like, please visit GuyPowell.com and sign up for more episodes. Giulio, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.